Just when I thought that society had gotten over the bizarre charge that Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, along comes an equally bizarre message to challenge my complacency. A newsletter from one of America's most prestigious universities has revived the accusation. Here's what the anonymous author, reportedly a Jewish convert to Christianity, wrote in Ichthus, the Harvard Christian undergraduate newsletter. "We, the Jews, collectively rejected God and hung him up on a cross to die, and thus we deserved the punishments that were heaped on our heads over the last 2,000 years." End quote. Stunned by the critical media response, Aaron Gede, editor-in-chief of Ichthus, offered a lame apology for statements that were very clear and explicit. And I'm quoting him here. "It was not the intent of the writer, nor of Ichthus, to present a piece that is anti-Semitic in nature or interpretation." End quote. This incident should not have surprised me, considering that I learned recently that 26% of Americans still believe that the Jews killed Jesus, according to a 2013 survey by the Anti-Defamation League. And the actual figure is surely higher because, as we well know, people are often reluctant to admit they hold politically incorrect views. How many would admit to disliking black people or distrusting all Muslims, even if those were their actual views? Nevertheless, it's puzzling why the indictment of Jews persists, defying facts, logic, and the consensus of Bible experts and researchers. The charge only appears to make sense if you read it as, "The Jews killed Jesus, facts to follow." But there never are any credible supportive facts. That's because the accusation is a code for hatred, and hatred stands alone. Even if one Jew, Judas Iscariot, was a turncoat, although the recently deciphered Gospel of Judas disputes that, that doesn't mean the Jewish people were collectively responsible. Indeed, the single fact that all of Jesus' devotees and followers, those multitudes that came to his sermons, they were Jewish, and that should have been enough to quash the accusation. Other details about the crucifixion are similarly suspicious. Why did the Jewish authorities pay an informant to locate Jesus? The Gospels tell us that the Sanhedrin could have seized Jesus at one of his outdoor gatherings or in a synagogue where he regularly prayed and taught Torah. Jesus makes that very point to the arresting party in Gethsemane Garden. And here I'm quoting Jesus. "Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me." That's in Matthew 26:55. The Gospel of Matthew goes on to explain that they feared a riot if they dared to arrest Jesus at a public gathering, that the multitude of Jews would rise up to defend him, and that's stated in Matthew 26:3, 4, and 5. Wait, the Jews would rise up, they would riot, and they would defend Jesus, and the Jews were against him? I've often wondered how many Jews were actually clamoring for Jesus to be crucified. Popular belief says it was a huge mob. You've seen it in Hollywood films like The Passion of the Christ that reinforce the notion. And I've seen it also, and I'm sure you have as well, in other television depictions. It's hard to believe that every Jew in the land gathered around chanting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" In poring over the Gospels for an answer, I was surprised to discover that few, if any, Jews were present at the trial and condemnation of Jesus, other than the Jewish officials. And here's what it stated in the Gospels. "And they led Jesus away to the high priest." This is after he was arrested in Gethsemane Garden. "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes." Okay? It was strictly the Jewish leaders. And that's stated in Mark 14:53, also in Luke 22:54, Matthew 26:57, and John 18:13. In fact, when they brought Jesus to Caiaphas's palace for interrogation, there were so few bystanders present, and no doubt some, if there were bystanders, they would have been part of the arresting officials. In fact, there were so few of them that the disciple Peter had made his way in this, kind of sneaked into the palace, But he was quickly identified by one of the maids who asked him if he was a follower of Jesus. This was the first occasion of the three denials of Jesus that Peter made. In effect, what he said was, Jesus who? No, I don't know the man, and I'm not with him. But why would otherwise ordinary Jews be in attendance at this interrogation? Remember, Jesus' arrest was a clandestine secret operation at night. Only the Jewish officials knew about it. Also, it was Passover Eve, and Jews were busy with purification and other preparations for the festival, the holiest day on the Jewish religious calendar. Then the next morning, according to the Gospels, Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate at his palace. This is early in the morning. Again, there's no indication of any Jews present other than the Jewish officials. This makes sense. The populace still didn't know that Jesus was in custody, and even if they had known, crowds were unlikely to have swooped down on the palace on the holy day of Passover, especially since there was always a strong Roman military presence during Passover, when, according to historians, there were often riots against the Roman presence, so movement of crowds would have been severely restricted. Suddenly, though, Pilate asks the multitudes whether he should free Barabbas or Jesus, and they unanimously vote to free Barabbas and condemn Jesus. But who are the multitudes, and where did they come from? They seem to pop out of nowhere in the Gospel of John. Is this scenario thrown in to please a Christian audience many decades after the crucifixion, especially at the time the Gospel of John was written, the last one to be written? It was penned 70 to 90 years after the crucifixion, when most of the converts to Christianity were Roman pagans. Therefore, there was no value in blaming Romans for Jesus' death, and a lot of value in blaming Jews in order for Christianity to separate from Judaism, that they were struggling to do. It was a bumpy road affecting that split with Judaism. So back to the trial, the multitude clamoring for crucifixion makes no sense unless multitudes refers to the large assembly of Jewish officials presiding at the interrogation of Jesus, as indicated in Luke 23:1. This is what Luke says. And the whole multitude of them, Jewish officials, arose and led him unto Pilate. Remember, there were 71 members of the Sanhedrin, plus elders, rabbis, and other officials who were at the interrogation. That was a multitude. Then, as Notre Dame University New Testament scholar Candida Morse noted, and I'm quoting her here, flash mobs of thousands of people do not miraculously assemble and offer complicated answers in unison without the assistance of smartphones. She goes on to add that there's even papal agreement. In Jesus of Nazareth, Part 2, Pope Benedict XVI asked, how could the whole people have been present at that moment to clamor for Jesus' death? Let me repeat that, because this is what Pope Benedict XVI said. How could the whole people have been present at that moment to clamor for Jesus' death? According to the descriptions in the Gospels, it's likely that the number of Jews who sided with the Sanhedrin and other officials who were present and called for crucifixion numbered 0, or a scant few at most. Consider also that Jesus' disciples went into hiding after his arrest. They feared being persecuted as well. If any other Jews did show up, they would have been stooges of the Sanhedrin. Otherwise, how would they know about the trial, and how would they even get into the palace area? So there was no multitude present. In contrast with this, consider Jesus' Jewish followers, which at times swelled to 15,000 Jews or more, as documented in all of the Gospels. Even if the number of Jews who opposed Jesus was greater than I've estimated, it would still be an insignificant number in the context of the Jewish population of Judea, Galilee, and surrounding areas in Jesus' time. Estimates of the Jewish population run between 500,000 and 600,000, with some as high as 1 million. Add to that another 1 million Jews in Egypt at the time, according to Jewish Hellenic philosopher Philo. These Jews most likely knew nothing about Jesus, and therefore could not have been against him. Jesus' ministry spanned only 3 years, and news traveled slowly in the ancient world. How tragic and mind-boggling the lethal consequences for Jews over the centuries of the charged Christ killers, if indeed only a scant number of Jews called for the crucifixion, while far more embraced him, and most never heard of him. Only if you read the Gospels through the eyes of hatred can you conclude that the Jews collectively killed Jesus. So how can the code for hatred be broken? Only when we all fully grasp the Jewish foundations of Christianity. That's why I've organized an art exhibit putting Judaism back in the picture toward healing the Christian-Jewish divide. The massive number of medieval and Renaissance artworks conditioned the way Christians and others perceived Jesus and Jews over the centuries. Moreover, these artworks have placed a wedge between Christians and Jews by depicting Jesus as exclusively Christian, without a hint of his Jewish origin. Their legacy continues to reverberate today, as in that Harvard newsletter. In vaporizing Jesus' Jewish identity, these artworks have falsified biblical history. Jesus and his family typically appear as blonde, fair-skinned Northern Europeans living in palatial Romanesque settings surrounded by medieval and Renaissance Christian saints and other anachronisms. This imagery has fed the illusion that Jesus and Jews were of different religions and ethnicities, and that they were in conflict, when in fact they were all Semites from more or less the same tribe. These false implications run counter to the depiction of the thoroughly Jewish Jesus in the Gospels, or as Episcopal priest Bruce Chilton stated in his book Rabbi Jesus, and I'm quoting Father Chilton here, "It became clear to me that everything Jesus did was as a Jew, for Jews, and about Jews." For this exhibit, artists are invited to submit artworks that restore Jesus' Jewish identity and introduce balance by presenting the two sides of the Jesus story: Jesus, the faithful Jew, and Jesus, whose life and teachings inspired a new religion that developed after the crucifixion. The premise of the exhibit is that the historic alienation of Christianity and Judaism will not be healed until Jews look at Jesus and see a faithful Jew, even if they don't accept him as the Messiah, and Christians look at an Orthodox Jew and see Jesus. For more information on this subject, visit bernardstar.com, that's bernardstar.com, and jewishjesusart.com. That's jewishjesusart.com. Thanks for listening. I'll be back with more soon. I'm Dr. Bernard Starr.